morning. How are you doing today? As you already know, Microsoft has acquired GitHub for $7.5 billion. This is the biggest news of the day. I've been working on this story since yesterday, but I knew that the announcement is coming on Monday, so I was waiting for final code. So I just published the story, and it's really incredible to see what's going on there. Since I kind of work closely in the desktop Linux space, I was not surprised to see the kind of comments people are posting, and most of those comments are, as expected, negative, and I have mixed feelings about it. First of all, the desktop Linux community, from among all the open source community, is I think it's the smallest community, but it's also one of the most vocal community, because what happens with other open source communities is mostly it's the actual developers or actual users who are using those technologies in their businesses or in their production, whether you talk about Docker or OpenStack or Cloud Foundry or Kubernetes or whatever. So they are actual professionals who are using it in those workspaces, so they know all the ins and outs of those technologies and how things actually work in the real world. Versus what happens in the desktop Linux community, most of the users are enthusiasts. They run Ubuntu or Debian or whatever on their personal computers, and by that extension they feel part of the larger open source community. Most of these people have never even contributed a single line of code. They don't use it in their professional setup. They don't offer any professional services around it, but they are users. And so what happens is most of these users also move to desktop Linux because they don't want to use Microsoft Windows, or they can't afford Apple Mac, and so they use Linux. And then what happens is that their move to Linux could be because of various reasons. It's not always about technology. It could also be because of political reasons, that we don't want to use anything from Microsoft or Apple or whatever is proprietary, or even from Google, even if they are posting everything on YouTube and Google Plus. So what happens is that it's more or less like a religious warfare against the corporate world than anything to do with actual use case and technology. So what happens is, whenever news stories like these break, they get all worked up because they suddenly feel that, hey, now Microsoft is going to destroy this project, even if they use that project at minimum already, but they have very strong opinions about that. And that is kind of sad, and that is why we started a channel, a show called Let's Get Serious, where we wanted to filter out all this noise and talk about the actual stuff that is going on, whether it's about technology or policies or politics, whatever it is. So I was interacting with some of those users, and I was shocked to first of all find that, I always expected that Linux users are supposed to be the smartest of the lot. That's why you're using Linux. But I found that most of the people were either misinformed or ill-informed, or had no idea how the actual word works. Some were saying, hey, Microsoft will just take away all the open source code that people host on those repositories and steal ideas. It's open source already. If somebody wants to look into that, they can look it. It's on GitHub, for God's sake, or Satan says, depending on who you believe in. But the reason I want to talk to you is that I want to dismiss some of these unfounded, I don't know what to call it. I don't want to call it FUD, because the whole problem is that, okay, these days there are only very few sources for news that these Linux users can consume. Mostly the sites that are there are run by someone who sits in their basement, reads the stuff online, and just throw or spit out their opinions. They don't interact with actual users. They don't interact with actual companies, so that they know the ground reality. I happen to be lucky that, you know, I travel a lot. You know, I go at least twice a month, and I actually meet people from, whether it's Jim Whitehurst or Mark Shuttleworth or people from Microsoft, SUSE, Google, no matter who you name, I meet them and I discuss these things to get, you know, to understand what is actually happening. And ever since Satya Nadella took over, I have only heard, you know, praise for what Microsoft is doing there. Because the company has changed, they have evolved, and now finally they are doing right thing. Though they have been doing open source for a very long time, but, you know, if you look at SUSE and Red Hat, you know, they compete, you know, and they don't miss any word when it comes to, you know, so competition is a totally different thing, and sometimes big companies use all the weapons that is at their disposal. And so Microsoft has done that in past, but ever since Satya Nadella took over, he recognized that the market is shifting, it's changing, is moving towards cloud and mobile, and, you know, all those emerging technologies, and all of that is powered by open source. That's why we started this channel TFIR, which talks about open source and emerging technologies. So if you look at, you know, you hear a lot of open source stories from Microsoft. It is not because they are trying to trick you into something. It's because they have realized that this is the only way going forward. Open source is the only way forward. So they are doing it as much as they can. I mean, they cannot just turn all the code, Windows and everything, and throw it out. Though eventually I would be happy to see Windows and Microsoft Office and everything to be open source. But I mean, you can just a 40 years old company, you know, it takes time to do things and to decide, and you have to kind of maintain a balance between business. And even Google, you know, they do throw the Android code out, but, you know, the software that runs or Chrome, you know, those are kind of proprietary. And we also know what kind of mess Android has created, because everybody can take it and everybody can slap it. So Google actually had to do a lot of things to ensure that to be able to use Google services or to be able to offer a secure Android platform, you have to kind of, you know, convert to a lot of those policies. Even pure open source projects like Kubernetes or OpenStack, where anybody can take, they had to come out with a lot of policies to ensure that there is no fragmentation. So if Microsoft releases Windows code base, you can imagine everybody will take Windows and it will be a nightmare. There will be so many security holes because people will not patch it themselves, people will not update it. So, you know, you have to be careful how you do it. Anyway, that is not my concern. My concern is that Microsoft has been doing a lot of things in open source. They are one of the biggest contributors. So I do feel that, you know, it's not a change of heart per se. That is Nadella's way of saying it. But the fact is that every company has realized that open source is the only way you can survive in future. So that is the de facto software development model. So that is one thing that, you know, it's not about Microsoft love Linux or Microsoft loves open source, but Microsoft is a practical and pragmatic company now. They embrace what they feel is good for the company. And now people also say, hey, when you talk about the word embrace, you have to look at, you know, extend and extinct. You have to understand that, you know, the past Microsoft policy of EEEs, you know, embrace, extend, and extinguish, is not valid anymore, because now we are talking about open source technologies. And if you think that some company can embrace, extend, and extinguish open source, then sorry, my friend, you don't understand how open source works. That's not how open source works. You cannot extinguish it. The very nature of this beast called open source is is open source. Anybody can take the code and do whatever they want to do. And do you think that company like Google, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Rackspace, CERN, Red Hat, SUSE, Canonical, they will let Microsoft extinguish the very technology they rely on? No, they will all form a band and take the code base somewhere else because it's all under Apache license. Simple. You cannot extinguish open source. So please, my friends, don't say that again. If you talk about open source, you cannot extinguish open source code base. Second, that Microsoft itself relies on these technologies, whether it's Linux or what. I mean, they have released Sphere OS, which is powered by Linux kernel. Now, The way open source works is that you cannot extend it, add additional features, and then cut everybody off from it, because then what will happen is, and that's what the mistake a lot of small companies do. What they do is they take an open source code base, they create a soft fork from that project, maintain that fork separately, and add additional features. But what happens is that now they have their own fork, and then there is upstream mainline kernel. Now, if they want to move from the version that they're running to be able to take not only advantages of the latest version or all the security patches, they have done so many changes, they cannot do that anymore. It will be so much investment, so much wasted resources. They will have to pay their developer, they will have to waste a lot of work hours to put all the code up there. At the same time, they cannot take advantages of all those code and all the changes that they made to the kernel. Now they cannot put it back up there because it has moved so far. So now they're stuck. They have created a technical debt and they're stuck. So it's pointless to use open source. So what most companies do is they stay upstream. They just create one more layer and add some of the features that their users use, but they stay with upstream. Red Hat, they use OpenStack, they use Kubernetes, SUSE, all these companies, Google, they all use open source, and they do the same thing. They stay upstream, they add something extra to it for their own customer or to have a competitive advantage over their competitors, but they stay upstream. And that is what Microsoft does. They cannot just take it and fork it and be stuck with it. Then the whole purpose of using the open source code base is defied. Nobody in a sane mind would do that. So please don't be confused about that also. They cannot do that. Now let's talk about GitHub. So I just wanted to make clear that about open source Microsoft and then extinguish all those things. If you look at GitHub, Git was created by Linus Torvalds because he has his own problem or his own itch to scratch, which was to have a version control system for Linux. He was using a proprietary system actually before he created Git. So he created Git, and then the people, Chris and Weber, they took Git code base and they built a service or hosting service around it. And they also try to build a business model around it. And since Git was a superior version control system, everybody embraced it. GitHub made it easier to use a centralized system to not only host your code base, because now companies don't have to worry about maintaining all of that work. They have one repository where their developers can, or not only their developers, but the wider community can go commit things and patch things and do things. And it's very easy. It's social networking, it's code development. It's amazing. But ironically, the code base of GitHub itself is proprietary. Well, one reason can be that it's a service. You don't download something on your machine to run it. So there was no reason to open source the code base. Just the way Ubuntu One code base was proprietary. This client was open source, but the code base that ran the servers was proprietary. So the irony was that GitHub, which was based on a fully open source project, GitHub that hosts almost every single open source project on this planet, is itself proprietary. So it was already a proprietary service. When you build a company like GitHub, your biggest challenge is how to build a sustainable business model around it, because it can grow only to a certain degree. It won't go beyond that. And most startups, their ultimate goal is to be acquired. That's why people, they're like serial startup, entrepreneurs. They build a company. I mean, look at Elon Musk or Peter Thiel. They just keep founding new companies, and they sell them, make billions of dollars, sell them, make billions of dollars, sell them. They are smart people. But so their smartness is in creating a new product that they can monetize from, and that monetization is acquisition or sale to a bigger player, because it's really difficult to build a very sustainable business model that to run open source technologies and survive. You can't, because these days as we are moving towards the fourth industrial revolution, there are so many components that build the modern, service or infrastructure or whatever you use, that one component will not help you survive and succeed. I mean, look at Red Hat. I was talking to Jim Whitehurst, Red Hat CEO, and even he said that, if Red Hat was not a proprietary company, then instead of making $3 or $4 billion, they would be making $30 or $40 billion. I mean, even a company of Red Hat size, they're making only $3 or $4 billion, which is like tiny compared to their market share. So just imagine how much GitHub can do. Not much. So the company was already going through a tough time. Their current CEO, he stepped down, and they could not even find a replacement for the last 9 months. So they had challenge, and these companies need help. Microsoft was already working with them as a partner. I think in May they signed a partnership, and Microsoft is already one of the biggest contributors on GitHub either way, and Microsoft engages with a lot of companies. So acquisition was ultimate goal. I won't say goal, but kind of destination of GitHub, and Microsoft happens to be a company that is acquiring them. Now, is it bad? First of all, acquisition, as I said, was the ultimate goal, so that is nothing surprising. Is Microsoft acquiring them is bad? And that is why I built the whole foundation in the beginning that Microsoft itself is transforming into an open source company. So you should not be worried about that. A lot of people tend to compare it with Skype and Nokia. Yeah, but first of all, that was a different Microsoft. At the same time, back in those days, smartphone warfare was at nuclear level. I mean, Apple, Steve Jobs had kind of, he went thermonuclear against Android. So that was a different world altogether. And, back in Steve Ballmer's age, Microsoft made a lot of mistakes there. And Skype is also part of that problem there. But when you look at enterprise space, it's a totally different world, especially in the cloud space where Azure team is actually driving a lot of open source efforts there. So I'm not at all worried about it. On the contrary, I feel that Microsoft will provide GitHub with all the funding now that they need. Of course, a lot of integration will happen between GitHub and Azure services. So people who are using Azure cloud, they will be able to do that, and that's the whole point. When you acquire a company, you also get something in return. You don't just give away. The best thing is Nat Friedman. I have met him and interviewed him earlier. I'll put his interview in the link below, and he's an amazing guy. He was a co-founder of GNOME project, and then he was also a co-founder Xamarin, which was acquired by Microsoft, and that company is doing a lot of good job when it comes to mobile testing and stuff like that. So he will be the CEO of GitHub after that. So I feel that things are going to be good for GitHub, things are going to be good for Microsoft and for actual users of GitHub. Now, Linux users, as I said, they have been skeptical of Microsoft because there has been some past between Linux and Microsoft. Though things have improved, Microsoft is now a Linux Foundation member, and Jim Zemlin has great things to say about Microsoft. Everybody that I talk to, all the way from CloudFormers, who's a Red Hat, they all praise the new Microsoft, because they do understand how things actually work in the real world. There are only 3 big cloud vendors: Google, Microsoft, and Amazon. There is nobody else, and all these companies are, actually Google and Microsoft work actually closely with the open source community. Most of their projects are open source, so companies do realize how the real world works. So they don't worry. Even Linux vendors don't worry. Linux users worry, but I would suggest them that you should look at, yes, it's important to be skeptical. It's really important to look at the past, but you should also see how people or companies evolve. Because if you fail to do that, then you run a risk of either trusting a company that, hey, they have been a good company, they will never change. Just look at your own Linux projects. Companies have gone through different canonical, they were a good company, then they got beaten up because they created Unity, then they got beaten up because they went to GNOME. Now they have kind of almost ditched Linux desktop. So the companies evolve, and now people beat them once again. First of all, they beat them for creating Ubuntu, and then they beat them for not maintaining Ubuntu. Anyway, the point is that desktop Linux is a tricky business. That is why companies like Red Hat or SUSE or even Canonical don't deal with desktop anymore, because they know it's a big giant mess. You cannot satisfy all those fans, because sometimes they are not reasonable and realistic. And I feel that too, because I have been part of the desktop Linux community, and sometimes it kind of frustrates me that people cannot see through that, and they just come with their religious warfare, that F Microsoft, F Google, F whatever, you know, which I don't think is a very good attitude. And that is one of the reasons why Linux is not succeeding, because of this, you know, hostile environment towards everybody. The community is like, you know, kind of is stuck in, frozen in some weird state, and they cannot get out of it. At the same time, I also meet a lot of professionals who use Linux, and they are fine with that. They use Mac, they use Windows, they use the right tool for the job. Linux happened to be one of the best tools, and open source happened to be the majority of the tools that they use on their system. And that is what I would suggest to all those people who are watching it, that please don't be so hostile when it comes to these kind of news items. It's okay to be skeptical, but it's also okay to, or I think it's actually better to be open-minded. At the same time, it's better to embrace and see how things actually work out, instead of, you know, deciding against it, or, you know, making a kind of building an opinion that, hey, you know what, no, nothing good will come out of it. That's I don't think it's fair, because if you have that kind of mindset, you will not go anywhere. And personally, I'm happy what Microsoft is doing, really. I'm not a GitHub user. Actually, I do have some, not a repository, but I'm a user. But it's really good. And yes, of course, I'll be really happy if Microsoft open sources the code base of GitHub itself. I do know for sure that if Red Hat acquired GitHub, though I don't think if they can pay the price of $7.5 billion, but if Red Hat acquired GitHub, the first thing they would do on day 2 of the acquisition is release the source code of GitHub. So Microsoft, it would be really nice if you release the source code of GitHub, make it itself an open source project, because everybody will love to kind of look into Microsoft's GitHub repository, how GitHub code base is maintained. Anyway, congratulations, and I'm looking forward to seeing what Microsoft does with GitHub. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. And also, I'm open to sponsorships. So if you want to sponsor to this channel, please visit tfir.io/sponsorship and become a sponsor. Hey, and one more thing, if you're an individual and if you like the kind of, you know, very balanced, no tinfoil hat, no conspiracy theorist content that I'm creating here on YouTube, please become a Patreon. The links are below. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye for now. And I'm wearing Linux shirt, and I have Linux there. Thank you. And this is Windows. Sorry, no, this is, yeah. So I use Mac, Windows, and Linux, all three. That's how it should be, right? Thank you. Bye.